Hello and welcome. It's happy hour with me. It is Eileen Cook, and it is September 4th, of which I am quite surprised. So one of the things I thought I would talk about today a little bit is the process of change and how people make a change. And the reason that this comes up for me is, as some of you know, I've been working on a book that will be out in just a couple of weeks. And in that book, a few people mentioned like, oh, I found the stages of change really interesting. It's a shame we never talked about it in office hours. And I thought to myself, I thought we had, but I guess I did a quick search and I didn't find it. So I don't think I actually did ever talk about it. So it was just in my mind. So I thought I would share it with the rest of you now. So where this comes from, again, as you guys know, is I steal things all the time from counseling. And it comes from a fellow named James Perchowski. Don't worry, there's not a quiz. But what he looked at is he wanted to figure out what stages that people went through in order to make a change. And he went through a whole schwack of psychological literature looking at like kind of what those different stages are, with the idea of putting forth the concept that depending where you are in the process depends what kind of help that you need. And this kind of comes about because if everyone was at a point where they were like, you know what, I really want to make a change in my life, and all it required for them was that acknowledgement, like, oh, I want to make that change, then it should be relatively a straightforward process to do that, because you would just say to people like, oh, you want to have a more positive attitude? Well, these are the ways that you have a more positive attitude. Or you want to eat better? This is what you do to eat better. So his question was basically, why is it doesn't work that way? And so he first started with trying to figure out like how people move through that process. And I think it's just sort of useful, one, for general life, in case you have anyone in your life who's trying to make a change. It'll make sense to you a little bit more. But it's really useful for characters, because fundamentally characters, of course, are making some kind of change. They're going through some kind of character arc in the book. I'm going to argue to you it's probably not likely that your character is going to necessarily go through all 5 of these stages in your book. And in fact, they may only be going through one of them at any given time. But it's just useful to kind of back up and have the full picture. So that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to start us off at stage 1, which he calls pre-contemplation, which is just a fancy way of saying even before you think about it, right? That's all that pre-contemplation basically means. And really the biggest thing to understand is someone who is at this stage doesn't think that there's a problem. Like, this is the stage of change before they even know that there's a change that they may be staging into. So someone who is at this stage would be, saying stuff like, I don't have a problem. The only problem I have is that other people are telling me that I have a problem. Addiction is a really good example to think about with this. So someone who is pre-contemplation at this would be like, I don't have any problem with drinking. The only problem I have is my wife nags me all the time to drink less, that kind of thing. But they see that anything is wrong. And they will have every reason, every excuse to sort of justify whatever their behavior is. They can come across as quite flippant and sarcastic in this stage, because if you raise the issue, you're irritating them. In the same way, if someone said something to you that you had absolutely no intention, like, well, there's no reason you should do this, where you would be like, are you kidding me? Like, of course not, right? Like, so that's where they are. They have no theory that they need to talk about that. Stage 2 is contemplation. So this is when people start actually thinking about things. So this is the idea that you kind of know things aren't necessarily working, but you're not necessarily committed yet to changing it. So if you were dealing with something like negative thoughts, this is where you would be saying stuff like, I know my approach and my attitude probably isn't helping me. If you were drinking, this would be, you would say like, yeah, the fact that I can't remember the last 3 weekends is maybe a little bit of a problem. But they don't really have any intent to do anything about it specifically. So this is where you'll hear people saying things like, I'm totally going to quit smoking when I get pregnant. Like, I know smoking's bad for me. I plan to quit smoking, but not right quite now. Like, someday when I get pregnant, then I'm totally going to quit smoking. Or you know what? Like, after things quiet down a little bit, then I'm going to start going back to the gym and getting healthy, where it's just this sort of vague kind of thing. And one of the things that we learned in counseling, which is always hard to articulate, so I actually looked down at my notes when I was saying this, is someone in this stage will argue the pros of the problem and the cons of the solution. So what I mean by that is, if smoking was my issue, the pros of smoking is, I would say, like, I know smoking's horrible for you, but you know what? It's the only thing that really relaxes me. And, you know, it's how I get out and I socialize. All of my friends, we all take a smoke break. It's just such a relaxing thing, blah, blah, blah. And the cons of solution would be like, I know I should, you know, quit smoking, but everyone who quits smoking, they always gain weight. Like, I just know I'm going to gain all this weight if I do that. So it becomes that thing where they will find any reason to argue the two different sides. So basically they're trying to talk themselves out of it. So they know there's a problem, but they're trying to talk themselves into not having to deal with the problem. So again, you could sort of think in terms of whatever it is that they're facing. They'll argue like, why, yes, it's a problem, but these are all these great things about the problem. And the sad thing is, with any of those things, there are still pros. Like, you could say, well, what are the pros of knowing you have a negative attitude? Well, you know, the pros are people might try and talk you out of it, or you feel like you're getting attention, or, you know, the con is, if I get more positive, I have to move on and accept that this really is it, and I'm not ready to let go of whatever thing it is I'm not letting go of. So there becomes this kind of moment of that. The next stage, stage 3, if you're keeping up and writing them down, although you don't have to because it's going to be in a fancy schmancy book that'll be out in a couple of weeks, is preparation. So that's when the person is basically saying, okay, it's time that I do something, and they're starting to come together with a plan. They're not necessarily doing anything yet. So if you were on the outside, this isn't something you would necessarily always see a change in behavior, other than they're starting to put together a plan. So if you're thinking about quitting smoking, then, you know, you're maybe looking at like, how much are those Nicorette patches? Like, I wonder how much those cost. I wonder if my insurance covers those. Oh, I saw a billboard the other day for, you know, a smoking cessation program. I'm going to write that phone number down. You're starting to gather whatever resources you think that you might need in order to do that. So our positive person is buying a bunch of self-help books and is thinking about that kind of stuff. And one of the things that you notice that happens in this stage really quite a lot is people start to notice. So I don't know if it did any of the women in here on purpose get pregnant, like not by accident. Yeah, okay, so Bonnie's a yes. So like, before you actually, you know, we're not going to get into details here, took the leap and got pregnant, like there's usually a stage where you start noticing that person's pregnant. Wow, like all these people are pregnant and there's babies everywhere. Like all of a sudden you see them all the places, and there's cute stuff on TV, and there's all these and you notice all of these things. And it's something that's called the recency effect. It has a fancy psychological term, which you don't need to know, but it's the kind of idea of, once something becomes into your awareness, your brain picks it up and thinks like, oh, I should pay attention to that. So for example, if you're thinking about losing weight, you'll see, hang on, I'm gonna yell, Cairo, I have a guest, and so Cairo hates my guests. I'm laughing because my dogs are insane and not very well behaved. So anytime someone goes into the bedroom, they forget that there is someone there. Oh, yes. Whenever that happens, it's an excellent example Leslie wrote about, like when something happened where maybe you've lost someone, whether that's the loss of a pregnancy or the loss of, you know, a child who was born or any of those kinds of things, all of a sudden you become hyper aware of all of those things out there in the world. And it's as simple as the example I used is when I bought my car, I bought a Kia, and I had never, hang on. When I bought my car, I bought a Kia, and I had never obviously bought a car like that before. I never thought about a Kia. I just bought it because I had read this article on Consumer Reports or whatever. But as soon as I was thinking about buying the Kia, I noticed they were everywhere. Like every time I would drive someplace, I'd be like, oh, there's another one of those Kia Souls. Oh, there's it. Like I had never noticed them before, but now that I was thinking of buying one, I saw them everywhere. So your character who's in a stage will start to notice all of those things. If they're losing weight, they'll notice, you know, there's a favorite place to eat and there's a favorite place to eat, or there's a person, like they will just notice everything kind of hyper aware. So if you have someone in that stage, those are things to think about. And also in preparation is a good time to think about a mentor character, because that's often, again, when someone is seeking information. And when we think of the purpose of a mentor character, it is often to actually seek out that information and find someone in that particular stage and get some advice from them. So that's a really good time for someone to kind of come in and sort of be either officially saying to your character, ah, young Padawan, here are all the things you need to know, or whether or not it is someone that they befriend or sort of start to seek out. And we know that there's all sorts of positives for that in terms of change too, which is if you surround yourself with people who are doing similar things, you tend to do that. So if you are trying to quit drinking, hanging out with a group of people who are heavy drinkers is probably going to make it that much harder for you to be doing that. So you're going to want to think about kind of who you have around you. So stage 4, keep in mind there's only 5 stages, and look at this. We're only now at stage 4 is somebody actually doing anything different. So it took us quite a while to get to this fancy little point, but it is only at this point that the character actually starts to do things. So this is the point where you throw away your pack of cigarettes, you slap on the patch. This is the point where you toss your birth control in the toilet and you say, hey, honey, come to bed, right? This is the point, whenever it is that you are trying to do something, you get up in the morning, you go to the gym, all that kind of stuff. And this is something that you see in films and in books a lot. Sometimes it's done as a montage, but it's the point where the person has finally had it, right? And so if my thought was like, I've been so depressed and I haven't been doing certain stuff, this is the point where I look around and I realize that I have like food crusted on my shirt and I've been in these sweatpants for 4 days, and there's like pizza boxes all over the house and all that kind of, and you see the person stand up and be like, no more, right? And they suddenly, you know, you see them cleaning the house and taking a shower and buying new clothes or whatever it is that sort of shows this sudden desire to take action. So that's what you're looking for, is some sort of point of doing things differently. In the beginning, this tends to be a very exciting process, because this is when you buy those fancy new workout clothes and you're like, that's right, you know, and you go to the store and you buy all the fresh fruits and veggies and you're feeling all like, that's right, I'm going to make me a kale smoothie right now. But keep in mind, like, this is a continuation of activity. So there's the point when you open up the fridge and you're like, oh, kale smoothie, right? Like, it's the last thing that you want, but you're still taking action. The final and last stage is maintenance, which is There you go. This is the stage where you're basically trying to keep up with whatever change that you're doing. This is the carrot and stick kind of thing where you're trying to kind of entice yourself to keep going, or, working on, ways of trying to stay with it. And there are two dogs, and both of them are being naughty at this particular point. There's a vacuum in the hallway now, so there's all sorts of trauma here. You just don't. Thank God they're here, or who knows what would happen to me. But maintenance is where people are trying to hang in there. And this recognizes and acknowledges is that true change is never a one-time thing. You don't say, you know what, it's time that I'm going to be healthy. And then you're healthy and you never have to think about it ever again. You never have to worry. Like, it's a constant thing to do that thing. And some things are easier to stick up with than others, but in general, true change is a constant process. And maintenance acknowledges that probably at least once or twice, you're likely going to fall off the wagon with that. So whether that is if you're trying to eat healthy and you go over to a friend's house and they have 7-layer dip and cheesecake bites, and the next thing you know, you ate. Like, you went like, no, fine, I brought my own cucumbers. But you ended up like eating absolutely everything on the buffet and stuffing extras in your purse. And you wake up in the morning and you're grossed out with yourself. For smokers, this is the idea that they quite commonly will find that, they'll be fine. And then either maybe something really stressful will happen and they'll find that they'll go back and have a cigarette, or they'll be out. And if someone is like, oh, do you want some? And they're like, yes. And they'll suddenly find themselves having a cigarette. Now, I've kind of laid these out, as did Prochaska, as like 1 to 5. Like, people are like going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. New change, 1, 2. But it doesn't usually work that way. Sometimes there's some back and forth that people are doing. There's some kind of in between different steps. Those all things are making a difference in how people move through them. And as I said, change rarely happens kind of once at a time. So some things to think about is when people are at different stages, different things help move them along. So if someone is at pre-contemplation, where they don't even think there's a problem, talking to them about, here's this great new effective way to quit smoking, won't work, because as far as they're concerned, there's no problem. So you're actually arguing the wrong thing. So you can start to see if someone is pre-contemplation, all that you should be trying to do is to raise awareness that there is a problem. So if you were out walking with them and you were going up a hill and they were like, hang on, I got to stop. Like, you would say like, wow, it seems like smoking has really impacted your ability to do some of the stuff you want. Like, all you would be, you're not trying to get them to stop. You're just trying to start to switch them to see that they might actually have a problem. Yeah, they would absolutely 100% have something probably not nice to say about that process. But it's just the stage of trying to get them to see something is going on. With contemplation, you're trying to tip the balance, basically. So now that they know that there's a problem, but they're not necessarily getting ready to do anything quite yet. So you're trying to kind of encourage that, to kind of keep raising awareness why it would be good to change, what's at risk if they don't change, and we kind of just wanting to do that. If they're in preparation, your best thing you can do is to help them collect that information, right? Like, here's the things that you need to do, and help them evaluate which kind of thing might work best for them. And then during action, it's just encouraging them and providing emotional support. And reminding them, particularly if someone's really gung-ho, which they often are at the start of a change, like letting them know, I know you might eventually struggle, and that's totally okay. I'm here for you then too. Because sometimes I think people feel, for example, with addiction issues, like they finally are like, that's it, I'm doing it, I'm done. And then they find, themselves starting to fall back. And then they feel like, well, in for a penny, like, I ate the cake, I might as well eat everything else in the house because there's no point, I failed. So letting them know that that's going to come up. And maintenance, you're basically just kind of always checking in and reminding people of how awesome it is and encouraging them to keep going. you can think about from a running perspective. Before I go any further, is there any questions about that, or did that make sense? Yes, Wingles in the corner there.
Often in our books, we have characters that are going through more of an emotional change, like learning to trust or love themselves or finding strength. So, do they go through those same things, but is it maybe a little bit not as concrete to see? Like,
It's definitely not as concrete to see, but you can see it. So let's take someone who doesn't trust anyone at all. In pre-contemplation, they'd be like, yeah, you shouldn't trust anyone. That's right.
oh, right.
Not a good deal, right? And in contemplation, they would be saying things like, I can see where it would be useful to have someone in your corner, someone that you could count on, but maybe someday, if I meet that magical unicorn I could actually trust, maybe then I would do it.
I can only trust my tongue.
But,
right? Pros and cons. Okay.
Yeah, they would be, but they would, exactly, they'd be weighing the pros of the problem, right? So like, I know that not trusting people is not good, but you know what? No one ever hurts me.
Right. Okay.
That kind of thing. And then in preparation, it's less because there's less of an action that they need to take, but they would have that heightened awareness. They would be looking around and seeing and noticing people who had trusting relationships. Action, of course, you'd actually see them making some initial attempts to put some faith into someone. And then in maintenance, of course, that would sometimes not go well. And then,
yeah. They could go back a few steps.
Yeah, and they may go all the way back, depending what it is.
Okay, great, thank you.
So when we talk about the idea that when they're in those early stages, you want to raise awareness that there's a problem, like how do you do that? So there's a couple of different things. So sometimes is pointing out risks of behavior. So, I mean, one of the things that you'll notice is there might be someone in your life who's had bad eating habits or smoking or any of those kinds of things, and they'll have some kind of significant health scare. This is often where you do see people make a change, because all of a sudden they go into their doctor's office and they're having a heart attack or, something like that. And it suddenly becomes very real and very unavoidable. And if that happens, they will suddenly be like, okay, I have to make a change. Sometimes we used to call it in counseling the ghost of Christmas future. But it was the idea of they come across or they meet someone who is now through the other side, who is talking about it. So I used to work at a chronic pain clinic. And one of the things that we would do quite often is we would bring in a past client who would come into the group session. And that person would talk about the fact that, they have chronic pain and that they used to be on high level of opiates and how they were dealing with it and their struggle, and then how they're coping and that kind of stuff. And it was this chance for people who had that problem to sort of see other people dealing with it. This is why you'll see in a lot of change programs, something like Weight Watchers, a really big part of that is testimonials of people who've been successful. And a big reason for that, of whether or not they know it, although I suspect that they do, a lot of money went into researching those programs, is that when you see someone who's like, hey, they're standing there in their pants that used to be, this kind of size, and you're sitting there in your pants that are still that size, and you see that person and you're like, oh, that person was in my shoes, they did it, they have all this stuff, like, I want to go and be that person too. And yeah, Weight Watchers has started a new program for teens. And I've heard mixed things on it, because it's also a thing of, there are more obese teens now than ever before. And Weight Watchers would say we're promoting healthy eating, not a diet. And there's a whole different value in all of that. And we'll never decide on that. But they will definitely, I can guarantee if they haven't already, they are putting some teen up there that used to be 1,000 pounds and who is now, the prom queen. You were going to say something, Alyssa. I want you to weigh in because you have a thought on this, I can tell.
Well, basically, Weight Watchers promotes ridiculously low calorie, and all the evidence shows that low calorie diets are more harmful in the long term because they encourage yo-yoing and they actually damage people's metabolisms and actually cause people to gain more weight. So all the evidence from Weight Watchers actually shows that they cause people to gain more weight and feel worse about themselves, and they're horrible.
And that was our Weight Watchers commercial. So yeah, I think from a stages of change point of view, they work really well, and they're creating ongoing customers so that will do that. But yeah, that's the ghost of Christmas future, where you're trying to entice them to see that. Consciousness raising may also be someone who is confronting them with their behavior. So someone in their life who is saying, might say there's no problem with your drinking. I'm telling you, you're a stinking drunk, and I don't want to be with you if you're that way. Sometimes it's almost a hypothetical thing, but you stumble across someone who might have a solution to your problem, or you're thrust into a new situation where suddenly you never thought it was a problem, but you're seeing something now that makes you aware that things are, and so something might change. There may be a war, or dragons appear, or magic shows up, or, any number of things where suddenly your status quo isn't working quite as well as it used to. One of the biggest things that we know is that strong emotions push change. And by strong emotion, I mean things like passion, anger, rage, not wishy-washy emotions, like big, strong emotions. And I know I've shared this example before, but it works really well, so I'm going to share it again. My dad used to be a very heavy smoker. And he apparently, didn't really see a point in quitting and all that kind of stuff. And, it was great. Keep in mind, this was the 70s, right? So, it was no big deal, blah, blah, blah. So that was my dad's approach on smoking. So in our house, the way things worked is that my mom was the one who got me up and moving in the morning, and my dad was the one who did our nighttime routine. And part of our nighttime routine is I'd brush my teeth, and then I would lay in bed, and my dad would read me a little story before bed, and then he would kiss me goodnight, tuck me in, and that was it. And apparently, I have absolutely no recollection of this. I just want to say I don't distinctly recall this moment of manipulation, but I am going to say it was pretty impressive on my part. So apparently around second grade, so 7, 8 years old, I declared at the dinner table that I no longer wanted my dad to tuck me in and do any of the bedtime stuff, right? And my dad, I remember him looking at my mom with that kind of like, so he's like, oh, I guess you're getting to be a big girl. You don't need to be tucked in anymore. And I looked at him and I said, no, we learned about the dangers of smoking in school. And I know that you're going to die. And I don't want to love you as much as I do now. And then I just wandered off to bed, taking my dad's still beating heart in my little hand. And it, like my dad talked about, like that just crushed him. Like he just felt devastated. And he began trying. It took him probably another 2 or 3 years to actually quit smoking, because he would try and fail and then try and fail. But it was that strong emotion that pushed him to actually making that change. This is kind of where you hear the idea that sometimes you have to hit rock bottom. You hear that sometimes. And that's the idea of like where you hit a point where emotionally you feel thrust into making that change. Like it's just become at a point where you no longer can stand the feelings that you have. So any kind, and again, when we talk about things around having a heart attack and then deciding to, okay, I've got to lose weight and start, doing more cardiovascular exercise, comes about from fear. Like all of a sudden the idea like I could actually really die becomes a real possible thing. And if we take something like your emotional example, Bonnie, this would be something where in some way you feel truly hurt. So just emotionally devastated by something that you see, and then you feel like you have no choice but to take action. So thinking about, can you put some kind of dramatic experience in for your character? And sometimes this is actually the inciting incident in your story. So something happens for your character where they suddenly now have to make a change. It doesn't have to be a big moment, but it may be something that hits them emotionally. So the example I used in the book is if you have a character who never trusted anyone, never felt like they could be in a relationship, and they go to a wedding, and they suddenly look around and they realize everyone went to school with, everyone was friends with, they're all married now. They all have their own families, their own kids, and they suddenly realize, like, it's me and great Uncle Harvey, who's 95, who are the only single people at this wedding. Everyone is paired up, and all of a sudden it's like, I have nobody that I can, and then all of a sudden they feel compelled to want to reach out and have someone in their life. The other example I used is, let's say that you have a shitty job. Like, you hate your job, you drag yourself to work every day, but you know what? It pays the bills. It's fine. And, one day you try and, you're walking past and the homeless guy overhears your boss talking to you. And the homeless guy says something like, well, I'd never put up with that. And suddenly you realize, like, this homeless guy has more freedom and happiness than I do. What am I doing? I had a version of this in terms of my very first job out of my undergraduate degree. I absolutely hated. I worked as a person who, they called me an admissions counselor, but my job was sales for one of those really tacky private training schools. Like, are you a loser? Would you like to be less of a user? In 33 days, you can do this, this, and this. So it was not a good thing. But, in theory, that's what I was doing. And I hated that job so very, very much. But it seemed somehow impossible to me to recognize that I was going to have to go back to school and do more training. Like, I just couldn't deal with it. And it was finally, for me, it was, lack of a better term, hitting rock bottom, was I realized that I would throw up on Monday mornings, like, pretty regularly. Like, I would wake up and I would just have that, like, oh my God, the whole week is in front of me. And I'd be nauseated and I'd often vomit. And it occurred to me, like, most people probably don't do that. You may not like your job, but if you're throwing up before you go to work, maybe it's trying to tell you something. So it wasn't a dramatic moment as much as it was for me finally, where I was like, that's it, I can't. And that's why I made the decision that I would go back to school. And in fact, went back and became a counselor so that later I could go back and change my mind again. And I see your question, Alyssa, and I will. We'll talk about try and fail. But I'm going to go through a couple more things quickly. The other thing is thinking about environment. And one of the things, again, that we talk about, and you guys have heard us talk about this, like, if you're trying to change your thought perception about your writing to post-it notes, right? I'm a really great writer. I have a story to tell. Or second person, you have a story to tell, depending, which one you're going with. And you're posting those up around the house. Or we'll talk about, like, how are you honoring your workspace? And you'll see a lot of people who will actually look at their environment, and they'll look at their desk and they'll try and set it up, or they'll have a vision board, or they'll have, like, Rena's awesome bookshelf behind them, right? Where it's like, this is my place where I look because I know my book is going to be on that shelf in a period of time. And so that's my way of visualizing that kind of thing. It's a big deal. And we don't tend to think of it. And this isn't to say that your environment is who you are, but there is a reflection of it. If you've ever, like, gone to someone's house for the first time, there's this tendency to look around at how they decorate their home to try and kind of understand them a little bit better, right? This is the stalking someone else's bookshelves. Not that we ever do that. You have to hold them up longer so people can see them, Leslie. You did not wake to be mediocre. And number 2, higher. There you go. Glenda the Good Witch, you always had the power.
I have a whole bunch of those.
Yes. And you hang those up, right? Yes. And Donna talks about doing it in third person, and all those kinds. And one actually second person. So you have the power to do that. You did not wake up to be mediocre today. So those kinds of things, there's some power in that. And we know that posting those actually does make a difference. And that's one of the things, like, if you are struggling with depression, for example, sometimes what they'll tell you is, if you can, like, to start with even just taking a shower, because you'll feel a little bit better if you yourself are clean, or get out of yesterday's sweatpants. Any of those kinds of things will sort of help you with that. And so that's why you'll often see about environmental. And this is why I think if you like movies, they're showing you all of this in a film. This is the montage sequence where the frumpy girl is like, that's it, I see myself as beautiful. And we see her getting her makeup redone and the new hairstyle, and she goes and she buys new clothes, and she throws out everything in her closet that is, you know, frumpy and not to wear, and all those kinds of stuff. So it's all those kinds of things that they're environmentally changing in order to have a change of things. So think about your character and how you might show their environment or the space around them. Think of yourself like a set director in a film. Like, how can I show the space around them or what they're wearing to show that there's been some kind of change? So any of those kinds of things will help you. And in fact, again, if you look at films, you'll see that in costuming. Like if you look at Katniss at the start of the Hunger Games, she's in sort of rags and all this kind of stuff. And if you contrast it with the very end, she's in that, you know, hot red dress. She's going onto the television screen and all that kind of stuff. So you're seeing that shift being shown in a physical way. So we're seeing it's different because they look different. So that will help. That will make a big difference. Another thing that's really helpful, which all of you guys who like all the woo-woo will be happy about this, is the self-reevaluation stuff. So this is the idea of visualization and the power of positive thinking. So if you go to a counselor, the things that we'll often do is we'll say things like, tell me to picture, imagine your perfect day. What does it look like if this was all done and over with? And we want them to start visualizing it. So if you're someone who wants to get fitter and lose weight, like imagine yourself doing the grouse grind and what it's going to look like and how you're going to feel when you get to the top of the grind and all that kind of stuff. Or picture yourself buying, you know, maybe there's a bikini that you want to buy that you feel like, oh, I can't do that if, you know, at my current weight. So if I had a bikini, I would feel amazing. So whatever it is, we want people to start visualizing it. And again, in writing, you can imagine that you might have the character start to imagine and thinking about, or they may have a daydream sequence or something where they're imagining what it would be like to be in that new place. You guys have heard me talk about push-pull motivation. So this is the idea of pull, like where you're just making it so lovely that you just want to get there. You just can't wait to get there. So I love all these ideas of people are picturing themselves with their long book lineups and all these kinds of things. It just works. And you are royalty, so you can talk about yourself like royalty if you like. Basically, the next thing we talk about is they talk about self-liberation, which is the idea that it's internal thinking, where you start thinking, like you shift how you talk about yourself. So instead of saying, I never do this, you say, well, I can do things different this time because of this. So it's another place of sort of positive thoughts. The grouse grind lineup. Oh yes. I've done it 4 or 5 times. It's hell. Don't do it if you don't need to, is my opinion. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is reinforcement, which is something that happens a lot in the maintenance stat, and that's the idea of setting up yourself up with carrots and sticks. But it's the idea of what things do you have in place. So someone who might be like, I'm going to do this, and when I reach my goal weight, I'm going to spend $500 on new clothes, or I'm going to let myself buy that vacation that I've wanted. And you can do this many things along the way. You certainly know that Crystal's a huge fan of this with her little bottles of champagne. When I reach this thing, I have this bottle of champagne. Those are carrots. Those are, you know, leading yourself out with things. Donna has found this website where you set up a goal and then you identify a charity that you absolutely hate. So for example, the Trump re-election campaign. And for me, speaking personally, your mileage may differ. And you have to put up money, so you put up $50 or whatever. And if you don't reach your goal by the deadline that you said that they will, they send your money off to the group that you dislike. So it is meant to be a stick in the idea that you will do anything to avoid, sending $50 to Trump's reelection campaign. Definitely would, put that out there in front of you. So that is the idea of setting something like that up. In general, carrots are more successful than sticks. Most people do a little bit better with reinforcement that is positive versus negative reinforcement. But there is some benefits to potentially both of those. So keep that in mind. So thinking about, again, whether or not your character has something that pulls them forward. All right. So now, Alyssa, when you say try, fail cycles, what are you talking about? Just so I don't start wandering into something.
Well, I think Donna had a bit about like every time you set a goal and you fail to achieve it, there's like a bit of your brain that starts believing that you're never ever going to get it. But then also like in a book, kind of one of the things to create a believable climax is to have these try fail cycles where they're trying to make a change, they're not getting there. So I feel like there's a way to integrate like those like try fail cycles in the plot with the try fail cycles of the cycles of change.
Look at you sounding so smart. Like I feel like we're like next leveling shit. Okay. So yes. So let's break it down into two parts. So one of the things that Donna's talking about is the fact that when you set a goal for yourself, so my goal is to eat healthy. So if I, go great guns out there and I'm going to the gym and I, have all the bean sprouts and everything in the house, and then I fall off the food wagon and I start, eating nothing but raw cookie dough on a giant log. And it's bad, right? It's not good. I'm putting chocolate sauce on it. It's really bad. I sort of reinforce the idea like, oh, I tried that and I'm not very good at it. And then when you try again, there is a part of your brain that is saying, the little tinkling in the background, like you've tried this before. You've tried to lose weight and you ended up eating cookie dough logs. What makes you think this time's going to be any different? So in the stages of change, like when I'd be working with a person, we'd be talking about that kind of often in the preparation stage. One, like what are you going to do differently this time compared to what you did last time? So identifying what was it that led you to kind of falling off the wagon, and can we put some things in place? I'd also be using someone who went through the process who would be talking about the fact like, yeah, I fell off the wagon a few times. And the truth of the matter is, because even though we say that idea of like, well, if you're setting up this fail cycle, well, you'll do that again, is also keep in mind that one, we're also always telling people aim high, because you don't hit anything that you're not shooting for, right? I was reading a self-help book last night that was by someone who's a fighter pilot. And he was talking about the idea that as a fighter pilot, he was trained the most important thing was the target. Everything revolved around the target. How much jet fuel does the plane need to get to the target? How much ammunition, bombs are we carrying to get to the target? How far is it to the target? What are all the alternate ways to the target? And he was like, so we were always planning for all these things that, something may go wrong, but you still had to get to the target. And he's like, that's one thing the military does really well, is it focuses you in on one particular thing. So you're always kind of aiming that much higher to do that thing. So I think that's what we're also trying to do, is aim high and then see where you go and where you get to. So you'd want to be talking it through, because 100%, Alyssa, I would tell you that your character should fail, almost certainly, because if they don't, one, it's a really short book and I would explain some problems you might be having with length. And two, that's not very exciting. Like if I said to you, like, more than anything in the world, what I want is to do X. And it's like, so I did it. The end. Like that's just not very interesting. And I always think I know some people who were very fortunate. So they happened to maybe sell their first book But you never see them speak at writing conferences because all the people in the audience don't want to sit there looking at someone who's like, well, it was the first agent I sent off the query to, and they loved it. And they picked me, they called me, then I sent it, they called me an hour later and offered me a representation. And then they sold the book on Wednesday. And I've been a New York Times bestseller ever since. Like, no one listens to that motivational speech. Like, basically, they all just want to spit in her coffee. Like, what you want is a person who's like, I had 100 rejection letters. I was on 110. I quit. I'd gone back, because that makes us feel some of that reinforcement. And the truth of the matter is, for most of us, that is the reality. There are the people who stumble into fortunate, great luck, but that's not the usual. For most people, it's going to be a try, fail, try, fail. So the question is going to be, how does your character pick themselves back up when in fact they do fail? Like, what is their ability to kind of do that? But when you look at these stages, you can see you could play with any part of it. Your entire book could be about them going from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Like, it could just be them being like, oh my God, I am an alcoholic. I'm going to have to do something. And that's the end of the book. But the whole book before that was about how they weren't ready to get there. Or your book may be that they are already, in the change stage, but it's maintenance. So you're showing them fail and try again, try and fail again, right? Like, you can see where you can play with any of them, or you might be showing someone who's doing all of those different steps. So that part is up to you. But the biggest thing that I wanted to kind of hammer home today is that it is a process. As counselors, we know that people don't just decide to make a change. There's usually some kind of process that they are going through to kind of gear them up for it. We are creatures of habit, and we do tend to do things the way we've always done them. So a lot of books out there, 21 Days to Mastery, all that. Have you guys heard about that? Like, to change a habit, you have to do it for 21 days. There's a lot of research that seems to show, like, if you can do something consistently for 21 days, you'll often kind of keep up with it. So you'll see people pushing you to really try those things. But it's much easier sometimes to try, fail. And that's going to be the secret. Questions or thoughts on any of that? I'm watching all of you. Leslie.
So I know Bonnie was talking about the internal change, and we're talking about the external changes that they have to do. Should those always be like in sync with each other? Like, they try this, but their head, they're still super, super positive, even though they're failing, or, and then they switch over where they stop trying, but now I don't know. Like, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. Like, can their head out of sync with their actual physical actions?
Their head may be out of sync, but then I would argue that they're probably at a different change. So I don't know if you've ever had someone who, they may be at pre-contemplation, like, I don't have any problem with smoking, but someone has talked them into, like, just to shut my wife up, I will go ahead and I will buy the Nicorette, I will go to the fancy smoking cessation hypnosis wahoodle that she came up with. But they're not really at the preparation action stage. They're faking it.
Right.
Yeah, because there's no problem.
I like that. Thank you.
So that would be someone who might be doing that. So someone who says, I don't know anyone who's ever done this. Someone who says, like, I'm a horrible writer, I'm never going to get published. So at some level, here's what I would argue as someone who has been known to do this. Sometimes people will argue their biggest fear because they want you to talk them out of it, because they don't have the ability to talk themselves out of it. So someone hypothetically might be, going through a divorce or something, and they'll say, I'm always going to be alone. I'm never going to find anyone else. And part of what we want is someone else to say, that's not true. Of course you are. Of course you're going to find someone else. You're spectacular. Because it's not that we think that but that's our biggest fear. And we don't necessarily have the capacity, for whatever reason, maybe we didn't learn it as children, to believe our own things. So we'll kind of put that worst fear out there. I think it also takes out some of the fear. Like there is that idea of, you know, in Jaws, they don't show you the shark because it's scarier because you can't see it. So there are some schools of thought that if you actually put out like what it is that you're most afraid of and confront it, it's easier. For example, taking the writing example, I used to be this person who was hanging out with Alyssa, and I would say, it's never going to happen. I'm never going to get published. And finally, basically, someone said to me, well, what happens if you don't? And I actually took some time to really sit down and think about what would happen if I never got published. And I realized like, oh, like that would suck. And I would be really disappointed in that. But I think I'd be more disappointed if I didn't at least try. And so some of that for me was the idea of, at the worst case, it's a no. It's not like someone's going to show up. It's not like the editor from Random House is going to show up at your house and beat you up. Like they're not going to, nothing horrible is going to happen to you if you don't reach your publishing goal. And you certainly have options of indie publishing and getting your story out into the world if that's the important thing for you to do. But for me, I had to face that horrible fear. And sometimes that's what people are doing is when they put things out there, like, I'm never going to find anyone, or I'm never going to get published, they're testing out that water to see if they can live with that discomfort level. But when they keep going, tells me that some part of them does in fact do that. It is one of the hardest things I think to do, is to face the fear of what happens if I don't reach whatever that particular goal is. What happens if I don't lose weight? What happens if I don't meet someone? What happens if I don't publish? Oh yeah, no, that's totally my thing, right? But here's the thing is, I'm pretty much certain that you wouldn't actually die. Very rarely do we see obituaries where someone says, after a long period of querying, Bonnie succumbed to query illness and surrendered. Like it doesn't happen that way. And so sometimes facing that and realizing, like, the bigger thing I think that I would feel worse about is if at some point I was at the very end of my life and I realized I didn't at least try to do the things that mattered to me. That would for me be a much bigger loss than if I didn't at least try. So I think that is sometimes that process that people are going through. So to think through that. And besides, Bonnie, you're going to publish. God is my witness. Nope. As God is my witness. And I'm just so we can have it here, and it's now all being recorded. Someday when we are at Bonnie's release party, I'm going to officially stand up and walk to the front of the room and yell in her face, "Told you!" And then everyone else is going to laugh and applaud until the book security drags me out. Fair? Fair. I know it's going to happen. I know it 100% to the core of my being. Oh, I just love you. Now you're going to make me cry. Cut it out. But it is true. So, and you know what I will do? I will actually print out a picture of Bonnie sniffing right now, and I will bring it to her book launch party. You know how they cut out those giant heads? You see the places? And I will hold it up in the front row, and it will be a moment of great beauty. So it'll be there. So that is what I have to say. Perseverance counts for a lot. Thoughts or questions? I think we should all wear dragon costumes. I think that would be lovely. Oh, that's lovely, Denise. Wrote a book for the grandmother and mother who wanted to but didn't find the perfect time. That touches my little heart too. Writing is such a personal thing, and I know that it is, and there are people who are writing books of their heart that are deeply, deeply meaningful for whatever personal story. And there are other people who are, writing a story that they just love and they want to see it out in the world. And I have 100% faith in all of you that your story will get out there, and look at the difference it's making for people. And the biggest difference when I'm asked, when people say, like, who gets published and who doesn't, I can't necessarily point to a particular piece and say this will get published or won't, because I can look at something like 50 Shades of Grey, and if that person had come to me as a mentee, I would have been like, oh, honey, let's just put this one away and start something new. Right? Like, I would never in a million years have guessed that that would have gotten published. Right? But she did. And, 6 bazillion people thought it was the best thing on the planet. And I've also read other books where I'm like, this book has to get published. And for whatever reason, it just doesn't find its time or its place. But people, I can point to people and know that they will get published, because the people have that certain something, and it is the ability to keep going. And that is what it is, because most people I know in this, it's a constant state of rejection. So the ability to pick yourself up and keep going, that's what makes the difference. Or if you decide you don't want to. I also know people who say, you know what, I tried, it didn't happen, I'm done, I don't want to do that anymore. And that's okay too. Like, this is not religious service. You haven't signed up to be a monk and you have to stay silent for the rest of your life. Like, if you get to a point where it's like, this brings me no joy, and you want to take up macrame or something else, like, live long and tie your knots, right? Like, do what it does that makes and gives you joy. But if you're still writing, my hunch is it's because that's what you want to be doing. And if you do knitting, you end up with socks. Just saying, it's a productive and useful thing. All right. So we switched into a little motivational speech at the end. That's okay. All right. So we are going to say a big woohoo for Alyssa, who's going to get married. I won't see you until you're a married woman.
Congratulations. Have a wonderful day tomorrow. Hope is the weather supposed to be good now?
There's supposed to be 2 hours of sunshine on my wedding day.
Good. That's all you need.
That's all you need.
Done. Get out of there.
Okay, and I have to tell you, I just noticed my own book on Rena's shelf, and it just gave me the warm wuzzies. I was like, hey, that looks like, hey, it is my book cover. So guess who's my favorite? It's Rena. Okay. All right, everyone. Good luck with your grant applications, Rena. I know those are underway. Happy wedding. Alyssa, Denise, get yourself to the grouse grind, wear comfy shoes, bring water. Leslie, keep us posted on all the changes and things going on for you as you can. And Bonnie, write that story and write it in the second person. You will do this. Bonnie will do this. Do those positive things. Yes? Okay.
Happy
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.